Somewhere around 1917, the servants at Winfield Hall grew accustomed to a peculiar sight. Their employer, one of the wealthiest men in America, wandering the marble corridors in a military uniform that had once belonged to Napoleon, a bicorn hat on his head, gold epaulets on his shoulders. He slept in the emperor's own bed, sat for hours in a red velvet throne, and kept a library filled with volumes on Egyptian mythology and occult rituals. His name was Frank Winfield Woolworth. He had built the tallest building in the world and the largest chain of stores on earth, selling nothing that cost more than a dime. At the far end of the house, behind a closed door, his wife sat in a plain room with a single bed and a rocking chair. Her mind had been gone for over a year. A nurse waited outside. Woolworth rarely visited. He had started with $300 borrowed dollars in a store that failed in 2 weeks. He ended with a marble palace, a Napoleon fixation, and a family that his fortune would systematically destroy. Chapter 1. Potatoes and Pennies. The farm sat 11 miles south of Watertown in Jefferson County, New York. It was not a prosperous operation. The soil in Rodman yielded potatoes and not much else, and the mortgage payments arrived with more regularity than the harvests. John Hubble Woolworth had returned from the Civil War and married Fanny McBriar in 1851. Their first son, Frank Winfield, arrived on April 13, 1852. A second boy, Charles Sumner, followed 4 years later. The younger brother's name was no accident. Charles Sumner was the Massachusetts senator and fierce abolitionist, and the Woolworths, devout Methodists who had supported the Union cause, chose it deliberately. The boys were expected to earn their keep. Mornings meant milking before school. Evenings meant picking potatoes by hand until dark. Frank hated every minute of it. He was a decent student, well liked by his teachers, but no one in Rodman expected him to become anything other than a farmer. The assumption was that he and his brother would one day take over from their father, just as their father had taken over from his. But Frank had other ideas. At the age of 4, he announced to his parents that he intended to become a peddler, like the traveling salesman who occasionally passed through the county. He and Charles spent their free hours playing store. Frank would arrange items on a makeshift counter and sell them to his younger brother, negotiating prices with a seriousness that amused the adults and baffled them in equal measure. The family lived near the remains of a property once connected to Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's older brother, who had spent years in exile in the United States after being deposed as King of Spain. According to accounts from later in Frank's life, the boys were fascinated by the stories attached to the place. Tales of distant empires, conquered kingdoms, and a general who had bent the entire continent of Europe to his will. For a boy stuck pulling potatoes out of cold dirt, Bonaparte represented everything that Rodman was not. Frank left school at 16 and went to work on the farm full-time. His mother, Fanny, saw the restlessness in him and intervened. She paid for her son to attend a bookkeeping course at a business school in Watertown, lending him money from her own family. After each day on the farm, Frank took the family pony and trap into town for evening classes. He studied the principles of commerce, but he studied the shop windows even more carefully. The storefronts along the main streets of Watertown planted something in him that the classrooms only reinforced. He dreamed of becoming a train driver. He watched the locomotives passing through Watertown and imagined a life of movement and distance. But he talked himself out of it. A merchant, he decided. That was more realistic. He began looking at every shop he passed with the eye of someone who intended to own one. Then came the moment that, decades later, he would still describe as formative. Frank and his brother Charles scraped together 50 cents in loose change to buy their mother a birthday present. They walked into a department store in Watertown and found a silk scarf. When they brought their coins to the counter, the clerks gathered around to laugh. The boys were mocked for paying in nickels and pennies. One salesman sneered that maybe next year they would scrape together enough for the matching gloves. Frank left. He bought a similar scarf at a different shop where the staff were polite. But the humiliation did not leave him. Walking home with his brother, he made a statement that, knowing what came afterward, sounds less like a childhood boast and more like a declaration of war. He told Charles that one day 50 cents would be enough to buy 5 or 10 items, and every customer, no matter how they paid, would be treated with respect. It would take him another decade to act on it. But the boy from the potato farm had found something more powerful than ambition. He had found a grievance. And Frank Woolworth was not the kind of person who let a grievance go. In the spring of 1873, Fanny persuaded her husband to release Frank from the farm for 6 months. Let him try, she argued. Let him see if he could make something of himself in town. John agreed, reluctantly. Frank packed what he had and headed for Watertown. He was 20 years old. He had no connections, no experience, and no particular talent for selling anything. What he had was a chip on his shoulder the size of Jefferson County. It would prove to be more than enough. Chapter 2. The Worst Salesman in Watertown. Frank walked into the Augsbury and Moore dry goods store in the spring of 1873 with a bookkeeping certificate and a proposition. He would work for nothing. 3 months, no wages, in exchange for learning the trade. Morgan Augsbury, the senior partner, looked him over and saw a young man from the country with no tie and no manners for the counter. He was not interested, but the junior partner, William Moore, liked the nerve of the offer and agreed to take a chance. If Frank proved useful by the 4th month, a small salary would follow. He did not prove useful, not in the way anyone expected. They put him to work sweeping floors, delivering packages, and restocking shelves. When they finally let him serve customers, the results were painful. He froze. He stumbled over his pitch. The staff began to treat him as a liability, and Augsbury privately questioned whether Moore had made a mistake. But Frank could do one thing that nobody else behind the counter could match. He could dress a window. Given control of the front display, he grouped merchandise by color and shape, stacked items at angles that caught the eye. The storefront became something that pulled people off the sidewalk and through the door. Augsbury noticed. Moore noticed. The customers noticed. Within months, the window became Frank's permanent assignment. It was while studying those customers that an instinct began to form. The standard practice in dry goods at the time required a clerk to stand between the merchandise and the buyer. A customer would describe what they wanted. The clerk would retrieve it, name a price, and a negotiation would follow. Nothing had a fixed tag. Nothing was within reach. The entire system depended on the person behind the counter. Frank, who was terrible at being that person, began to see the flaw. What if the goods were placed where people could touch them? What if every item had a price already attached? What if the display did the selling, and the clerk simply handled the money? He could not have explained it in those terms, but the seed was in the ground. He stayed at Moore's place for 6 years. His wages crept up to $10 a week, were cut back to 8 after a poor stretch, and drove him to such exhaustion at one point that he collapsed and spent 6 months convalescing at home. He was not built for the grind of daily retail as it existed, but he was assembling a different model in his head, one that would replace the old system entirely. Jenny Crichton entered his life somewhere in the middle of those years. She had been born in Picton, a small town in Ontario, Canada, and worked as a seamstress in the same shop. Where Frank was restless and volatile, Jenny was steady. Where he dreamed in large, impractical arcs, she dealt in what was real and what was needed. They married on June 11th, 1876, in what by all accounts was a genuine love match. Jenny would later tell friends that the early years were the best, not because of what they had, but because of how much of Frank she got to keep. When there was no empire to run, he came home at night. When there was no fortune to manage, they sat together. She once said she had been happier when they did not have a dime. By the time anyone thought to write it down, she was no longer able to say much of anything at all. Frank's final lesson at Moore's came from a surplus clearance sale. Leftover stock was piled onto a table and priced at 5 cents each. The items sold quickly. Customers who would never have looked at them behind a glass case grabbed them eagerly when the price was visible and the goods were within reach. Different accounts credit different people with planting the idea. One version says a traveling salesman mentioned 5-cent counters in Michigan. Another says Frank overheard Moore discussing the concept with a competitor. A third says he simply observed it himself and drew his own conclusions. The origin mattered less than the confirmation. The 5-cent table proved what his front window had already suggested. People would buy almost anything if the price was clear, the access was easy, and the experience did not make them feel small. He had the concept now. He just needed someone to lend him the money. Chapter 3. $300 and a bad address. William Moore advanced him $300 in merchandise, not cash, stock, thimbles, combs, button hooks, harmonicas, baby bibs, soap, pencils, and napkins, the kind of small items that cluttered the back shelves of every dry goods operation in the Northeast. Moore also released Frank from his duties at the shop to go and find a location. He chose Utica, New York. On February 22, 1879, Frank opened the doors of Woolworth's great 5-cent store on Bleecker Street. The space measured roughly 13 feet by 20. Everything inside was priced at a nickel. The first days were promising. Customers came in, picked things up, turned them over in their hands, and bought. The novelty of walking into a place where every price was known and nothing required negotiation drew people through the door. But the novelty faded. The location was poor, foot traffic thinned, and within a few weeks, the operation was finished. Frank paid Moore back what he owed, packed up the sign, and left. He did not, however, pack up the idea. What failed in Utica was the address, not the principle. Frank remained certain of that. A friend suggested Lancaster, Pennsylvania, deep in the heart of Pennsylvania Dutch country, where thrift was a cultural value and a 5-cent bargain might land differently. Frank hauled the same sign across state lines and reopened on June 21st, 1879, on North Queen Street. First-day sales came to $127.65. By the standards of a one-man operation selling nickel merchandise, that was extraordinary. Within weeks, Frank made a decision that would define the rest of his career. He added a second tier of goods priced at 10 cents. The expanded range meant he could carry items that had real household utility, not just novelties and trinkets. Customers who came in for a 5-cent comb left with a 10-cent set of napkins. The average transaction doubled. Lancaster held. The store turned a profit. Frank brought in his brother Charles to manage a second location in Harrisburg. That one struggled with a difficult landlord and eventually closed. A third attempt in York, Pennsylvania, lasted only months before it too folded. The pattern was brutal. For every location that held, another failed. Frank learned to read a town quickly, to identify foot traffic, to spot the difference between a main street and a side street that looked like a main street. What he also learned was that he could not do it alone. Each new location required a manager, and Frank discovered that the best managers were people who had a personal stake in the outcome. He began recruiting partners from the circle he already knew. Former colleagues from Moore's shop, family members who understood the work, men who would invest their own savings alongside his merchandise and split the profits. Every new opening was a small partnership, and every successful partner became a node in a growing network. By 1889, a decade after the Utica failure, Frank Woolworth had 12 profitable locations across Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. His sales had increased by 240%. By 1900, the chain had grown to 59 outlets, with annual revenue exceeding $5 million, a figure equivalent to roughly $155 million in today's money. The red storefront had become recognizable. The 5 and 10 format had proven it could work in small towns and mid-sized cities alike. And Frank, the young man who could not sell a bolt of cloth to save his career, had built something that no single salesman could have matched. A system. A machine that moved merchandise by removing every barrier between the product and the customer. But he was still buying through wholesalers, still paying middlemen, and still watching margins shrink on his most popular lines. The next step would require a different kind of ambition. Not more locations, more control. Chapter 4. The Syndicate. The move to Brooklyn came in 1886. Frank needed to be closer to the wholesale suppliers clustered around New York's commercial waterfront, and he needed a central office from which to direct what was becoming too large for one man to oversee by letter and rail. He rented space on Chambers Street in Lower Manhattan and began writing daily dispatches to every manager in the chain. The letters were detailed, specific, and relentless. Which items were selling, which were not. How the windows should look, how the counters should be arranged. He prescribed the layout of each location down to the placement of merchandise on individual tables, and he expected compliance. Managers who performed well received praise and bonuses. Those who did not received a visit from Frank himself, who had developed a habit of walking into his own outlets unannounced and pocketing merchandise to see whether the staff noticed. Those who caught him were sometimes rewarded. Those who did not received a conversation they preferred not to repeat. But the real breakthrough in those early years on Chambers Street was not organizational. It was about supply. Frank had been buying through wholesalers, paying their markup, and watching his margins compress as the chain grew. When he decided to stock candy, he went around the middlemen entirely and purchased directly from the manufacturers. The savings were immediate and substantial. The manufacturers, in turn, were willing to cut prices for a buyer who could guarantee volume across dozens of locations. Frank applied the same approach to other product lines, and within a few years he was sourcing goods from factories across the United States and Europe, often taking an entire production run at a negotiated rate. This was the shift that transformed the 5 and 10 from a clever retail concept into an industrial operation. Volume purchasing gave Frank leverage that no individual shopkeeper could match, and it attracted attention from the men he had trained. The partner managers who had opened locations on Frank's behalf in the 1880s had learned his methods well. Several had grown ambitious enough to strike out on their own, launching independent chains that used the same format, the same pricing, and the same visual identity. Rather than fight them, Frank did something counterintuitive. He organized them. The arrangement became known as the Friendly Rival Syndicate. Each chain operated under its founder's name, set its own strategy, and competed with the others for territory. But they pooled their buying power through Frank's purchasing office, shared information on what sold, and carried much of the same merchandise. The rivals looked alike from the outside: the red facades, the open counters, the fixed prices. Inside, they were separate businesses, run by men who owed their start to the same dry goods operation in Watertown. The key figures were Frank's own people. His cousin Seymour Horace Knox had built a chain of over 100 outlets. Fred Morgan Kirby, who had partnered with Charles Woolworth on a successful operation in Wilkes Barre back in 1884, controlled 84 more. Earl Perry Charlton ran 48, concentrated in Canada and the western states, and Charles Woolworth himself, Frank's quieter brother, managed 14. Frank's chain, the largest, operated 319. The family network ran deeper than the founders. Jenny's sister, Mary Creighton, became what was reportedly the first woman to manage a Woolworth outlet, overseeing the branch in Poughkeepsie before being promoted to run a flagship location in New York City. Jenny's brothers managed branches in Connecticut. The operation was a family enterprise in the most literal sense, and loyalty was both expected and rewarded. When Frank eventually took the company public, he gave William Moore, the man who had advanced him that first $300 in stock, a payment of $500,000 in gratitude. By 1900, the syndicate collectively dominated the American market for low-priced goods. But the structure had a weakness. 5 independent chains meant 5 separate corporate entities, each vulnerable to acquisition by an outsider. In 1905, Frank incorporated his own chain as F.W. Woolworth and Company, selling shares to trusted managers and family members. It was a defensive move. In a letter to his managers, he wrote with apparent reluctance that modern methods must be pursued. The other syndicate members followed, incorporating their own chains over the next few years. The final step came on November 12, 1911. Frank persuaded all 4 rivals to merge their operations into a single corporation under the Woolworth name. The agreement brought 596 locations under one roof with $65 million in combined capital. Frank became president. Knox, Kirby, Charlton, and Charles each took a seat as vice president. It was, at the time, the largest retail consolidation in American history. The farm boy from Rodman now controlled a commercial empire that stretched from the Atlantic seaboard to the Rocky Mountains. He had done it without a single bank loan, without a single share sold to the public at large, and without ever learning how to sell a customer a yard of fabric. He had, however, learned how to build something that did the selling for him, and he was about to prove it in steel and stone. Chapter 5. The Cathedral of Commerce. In 1910, Frank Woolworth began quietly buying up properties along Broadway and Barclay Street in Lower Manhattan. He used a real estate agent named Edward Hogan to handle the purchases, and he told no one outside his immediate circle what he intended. By April, he owned the entire block. The site faced City Hall Park, one of the few open spaces in Lower Manhattan where a tall structure could be seen from a distance rather than swallowed by the buildings around it. His original idea was modest by the standards of what followed. A commercial office building, 12 to 16 stories, large enough to house the Woolworth Company headquarters and generate rental income from tenants. But modesty did not last. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Tower had recently risen to 700 feet on Madison Square, claiming the title of the world's tallest structure. Frank looked at it, and then he looked at his architect's drawings, and the numbers started climbing. He had hired Cass Gilbert, a Minnesota-born architect who had trained at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and worked for the prestigious New York firm of McKim, Mead & White before establishing his own practice. Gilbert had earned a national reputation designing civic buildings, including the Minnesota State Capitol. He understood how to make a structure feel important. Woolworth sent him to London to study the Houses of Parliament and the Victoria Tower, with instructions to bring back something that carried the same weight. Gilbert delivered. His design grew from 20 stories to 40, then higher. By the time Woolworth finished pushing, the plans called for 60 stories reaching 792 feet. Every vertical line in the facade would pull the eye upward. The exterior would be clad in cream-colored architectural terracotta, with Gothic ornaments scaled large enough to read from street level. Finials, arches, and gargoyles would reference the medieval cathedrals of Europe. The building would look like it belonged to an older, grander civilization, while its skeleton was pure 20th century engineering. That skeleton required 69 pneumatic caissons driven 100 to 120 feet through Manhattan clay and sand to reach solid bedrock. The steel frame rose fast. Workers topped out the structure on July 1st, 1912, 2 weeks ahead of schedule. Frank watched every stage of the construction and involved himself in details that most clients left to the architect. He insisted on the highest specification materials. He wanted marble in the lobby, mosaics on the vaulted ceilings, and stained glass filtering light from above. Then he wanted it taller. Then he wanted it taller still. The cost escalated from an initial estimate of $5 million to a final figure of $13.5 million. Goldman Sachs refused to finance the project. Frank paid for everything himself. Cash. No mortgage, no bonds, no outside investors with leverage over the design. It was his building, and he intended it to function as the largest advertisement in the world. Every person who looked at the New York skyline would see his name. He was also determined to turn a profit. Frank marketed the office space personally, charging a minimum of $4 per square foot, and emphasizing the building's safety features. He arranged a demonstration for nervous tenants. A raw egg was placed in one of the elevators 700 feet up. The cable was cut. The pneumatic brakes engaged, and the car glided to a stop without cracking the shell. Tenants signed leases. Within weeks of opening, the building was generating income. The grand opening took place on April 24, 1913. President Woodrow Wilson, seated in the White House, pressed a telegraph button at the appointed hour. 80,000 incandescent bulbs fired simultaneously, illuminating the tower from base to crown. The effect, seen from across the East River and from ships in the harbor, was described by Scientific American as a great crystal of flaming light. The Reverend S. Parks Cadman, standing in the lobby, looked up at the barrel-vaulted ceiling with its Byzantine mosaics and declared it the Cathedral of Commerce. Gilbert had placed sculpted caricatures on the ceiling beams of the entrance hall. One showed Frank Woolworth hunched over a pile of coins, counting his nickels. Another showed Gilbert himself cradling a small model of the building in his arms. Frank reportedly considered these his favorite features in the entire structure. The man who had been mocked for paying in loose change now presided over the highest occupied point on earth, and he had paid for it the same way, coin by coin. The tower held its title for 16 years. In 1929, the nearby tower at 40 Wall Street edged past it, and the Chrysler Building followed within months. But by then, the Woolworth Building had already secured something that raw height could not guarantee. It had become a landmark, not because it was tall, but because Cass Gilbert and Frank Woolworth had given it a face that people remembered. The Gothic spire above Broadway became a fixed point in the city's identity, as permanent as the bridges and the park below it. Frank called his private office inside the tower his imperial capital. The choice of words was not accidental. The nickels and dimes had built an empire, and now they had built its throne room. He sat higher above the ground than any other private citizen on the planet, directing a chain of over 1,000 locations from a desk surrounded by marble and gold leaf. But the view from the top floor did not extend to the rooms of his own house, where things were beginning to fall apart. Chapter 6: The Daughters and the Death at the Plaza. By 1910, Frank Woolworth had arranged his family like a window display. He owned his own mansion on 5th Avenue at 80th Street, across from the Metropolitan Museum, and he had purchased townhouses for each of his 3 daughters on the same block. Helena lived next door. Edna was 2 houses down. Jessie was around the corner. It looked like a family that had everything, including proximity. In practice, it was a row of expensive boxes occupied by women who rarely saw their father and could not reach him when they did. Helena, the eldest, had been born in 1878. She married Charles Edward McCann, a former assistant district attorney, in 1904. It was a solid match. McCann came from money but not scandal, and Helena settled into a life of philanthropy and quiet stability on Long Island. She bore 3 children, stayed out of the press, and spent her inheritance wisely. Of the 3 Woolworth daughters, she would be the only one to escape more or less intact. Edna came next, born in 1883. She was quieter than her sisters, more introverted, and more vulnerable. In 1907, she married Franklin Laws Hutton, a young financier connected to the brokerage firm that would later carry his family name. Frank Woolworth had reservations about the match. Hutton was charming and ambitious, but there were already whispers about his fidelity. The reservations were overruled, and the wedding went ahead. Jessie, the youngest, born in 1886, presented a different problem. She fell in love with James Paul Donahue, a handsome Irish-American whose family fortune derived from a fat rendering factory on the west side of Manhattan. The source of the money appalled Frank Woolworth. He begged Jessie not to marry him. She married him anyway. Frank forgave her within months, as he always did with his daughters, and added a townhouse to the collection. Frank compensated for his absence with extravagance. Every buying trip to Europe produced armfuls of presents for the girls. Dolls from Paris, silks from Venice, music boxes from Vienna. As the daughters grew older, the gifts became more elaborate, but the time together did not increase. Jenny managed the household alone. Frank came home less as the empire grew, and when he did, the conversations were shorter. By 1916, Jenny was no longer capable of managing anything, but the family's crisis was not coming from her direction. Edna's marriage had been deteriorating for years. Franklin Hutton drank heavily and kept mistresses with little effort to conceal them. Edna, isolated and increasingly despairing, had sought help from her father, but Frank was consumed by the construction of Winfield Hall, his new estate on Long Island, and by the demands of a business that left room for little else. He tried to intervene once, reportedly confronting Hutton, but the confrontation changed nothing. Hutton continued as before. On the evening of May 2nd, 1917, Edna was at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan. The details of what happened in her room have never been fully established. The official cause of death was suffocation resulting from mastoiditis, an infection of the bone behind the ear. No autopsy was performed. The coroner signed the certificate without one. But the rumors began almost immediately. Sources close to the family said that Edna had received a letter confirming the existence of yet another mistress. According to these accounts, she put on her finest lace dress, sat by the window of her suite, and swallowed a lethal quantity of strychnine crystals. She was 33 years old. Her daughter Barbara, 4 years old, was the one who found her. The child was led away by staff. Franklin Hutton was not present. Frank Woolworth was at Winfield Hall hosting a party. When the call came, the gathering ended. That same night, according to a story repeated by multiple members of the household, a crack appeared in the marble family crest mounted above the fireplace in the main hall of Winfield Hall. The crest bore the carved faces of all 3 Woolworth daughters. The crack ran directly through Edna's face, leaving Helena and Jessie untouched. Frank never recovered from it. He had built an empire on the principle that every problem had a solution if you controlled enough of the variables. His daughter's death was the one variable he could not control, and the one failure that no amount of money could reverse. He buried Edna in the family mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Then he went back to Winfield Hall, where the marble crack remained above the fireplace, and where the corridors were beginning to feel less like a palace, and more like something else entirely. Chapter 7. Emperor Napoleon of Glen, Cove. The first Winfield burned in 1916. Nobody ever determined the cause. Frank Woolworth had purchased the property 2 years earlier, a 16-acre estate on the bluffs of Glen Cove overlooking Long Island Sound. The original house was large, comfortable, and not remotely sufficient for a man who had just finished building the tallest structure on Earth. He had already commissioned the architect Charles Pierpont Henry Gilbert to draw plans for a replacement. When the fire reduced the old house to its foundations, the new plans were ready to go. The timing struck many as convenient. It struck some as suspicious. What rose in its place was not a house in any conventional sense. It was a monument. Gilbert designed a 56-room Italian Renaissance residence clad entirely in marble on the theory that marble would not burn. The construction cost $9 million. The grand staircase alone, carved from pink and beige marble and rising through the center of the entrance hall, accounted for $2 million of that figure. The ceilings were trimmed in 24-karat gold. The floors were exotic hardwood. 16 fireplaces warmed the 12 bedrooms, and a network of tunnels and hidden passageways connected rooms that had no obvious reason to be connected. The house had a ballroom, a billiard room, a solarium, a formal dining room, a music room fitted with an Aeolian pipe organ so powerful that it could be heard from half a mile away, and a library. The library is where it begins to get strange. The shelves held works on ancient Egyptian religion, ceremonial magic, and the occult sciences that had fascinated European aristocracy since Napoleon's campaign along the Nile. Woolworth, who by this point had moved beyond admiration into something closer to identification, adopted Egyptian motifs for his own home. Scarabs, serpents, and cartouches appeared in the carved stonework throughout the house. Winged figures with the face of the Egyptian sun god decorated the upper walls, and woven among all of it, recurring and unmistakable, were carvings of Woolworth's own mustachioed face staring down from the ceilings. His granddaughter Barbara, who spent time in the house as a child, would later call it the House of Horrors. The second floor was arranged as a sequence of period rooms, each decorated in a different historical style. There was a Ming Dynasty room, an Elizabethan room, a Louis XIV room, a Marie Antoinette room, and at the heart of the corridor, the room that explained everything else. A precise replica of Napoleon Bonaparte's bedroom at the Château de Malmaison. Woolworth had scoured auction houses and private collections across Europe to furnish it. The bed had a canopy of 14-karat gold leaf and had reportedly once belonged to the emperor himself. The bath was pink marble. The furniture was Empire style, heavy and symmetrical, arranged exactly as it appeared in contemporary illustrations of Malmaison. This was not a collector's tribute. Woolworth did not display these items behind glass or treat them as historical curiosities. He used them. He wore the uniforms. He sat in what he called the emperor's chair. According to those who worked in the house, he spent hours alone in the Malmaison room with the door closed, surrounded by the possessions of a man who had been dead for nearly a century. Adjacent to Woolworth's suite was the Empress Josephine room. It was decorated in the style of Napoleon's first wife and connected to Woolworth's bedroom by a passage that the household referred to, with characteristic understatement, as the private corridor. The room was not occupied by Jenny Woolworth. According to multiple accounts, it was occupied by Woolworth's mistress. Jenny's own bedroom, at the opposite end of the house, was bare by comparison. No gilding, no historical motif, no passage to anyone. The contrast was not subtle, and it was not accidental. The entrance to the estate was framed by a stone archway modeled on the Arc de Triomphe. The driveway, lined with life-sized Grecian statues, led visitors past formal gardens maintained by a staff of 70. The house itself required an additional crew of servants, estimated at 75, to keep it running. Woolworth presided over all of it with the conviction that he was not merely imitating Napoleon, but continuing his work. Several people close to him reported that he believed himself to be the emperor reincarnated, a claim he appears to have made without irony. Whether this was genuine delusion, theatrical eccentricity, or something in between, the house made it physical. Every surface, every room, every hidden passage expressed the interior world of a man who had grown up on a failing farm in upstate New York and now lived inside an imperial fantasy built from nickels and dimes. The organ played at night. The golden ceilings reflected candlelight. The carved face of the owner watched from above. And somewhere at the far end of the house, behind a door that rarely opened, Jenny sat alone and recognized nothing. Chapter 8, The Unsigned Will. In 1916, around the time Jenny's condition became impossible to ignore, Frank Woolworth promoted a young man named Hubert Templeton Parson to the position of general manager of the F.W. Woolworth Company. Parson had joined the firm as a bookkeeper in 1892, when he was barely out of his 20s, and had risen through the ranks by being efficient, loyal, and always available. Frank treated him like the son he never had. He trusted Parson with operational decisions, confided business strategy to him, and placed him closer to the center of the company than any of the founding syndicate members. Then Parson began to compete. He built a mansion on Fifth Avenue that was by several accounts larger than Woolworth's own. He purchased a country estate in Long Branch, New Jersey, called Shadow Lawn, which was grander than Winfield Hall. When Woolworth bought a new automobile, Parson bought a newer one, complete with a uniformed chauffeur. The mimicry was so persistent and so deliberate that people in the Woolworth organization began to talk about it openly. Whether Parson was driven by ambition, insecurity, or a genuine belief that he had outgrown his patron, the effect on Frank was corrosive. The man who had controlled every detail of his empire for 40 years now had a subordinate who appeared to be rehearsing for the role of successor. Frank did not fire him. He did not confront him. He withdrew. After Edna's death in May of 1917, something in Frank's constitution broke. He began experiencing violent mood swings, alternating between periods of frantic energy and weeks of near-total collapse. He would appear at the Woolworth building in the morning and be unable to leave his office by noon. He would retreat to Winfield Hall and remain in his Napoleonic bedroom for days at a time, seeing no one. The staff learned to read the signs and to stay clear when the door was closed. His physical health deteriorated in parallel. He had suffered from digestive problems for years, and a bout of what may have been typhoid in the late 1880s had left him with a constitution that never fully recovered. But the most dangerous weakness was the one he refused to address. Frank Woolworth was terrified of dentists. The fear was lifelong, irrational, and absolute. He would not submit to an examination. He would not allow instruments near his mouth. By 1918, several of his teeth had decayed badly, and at least one had become severely infected. His doctors urged him to seek treatment. He refused. On April 5th, 1919, 3 days after leaving his desk at the Woolworth building for what would prove to be the last time, the infection reached his bloodstream. Sepsis set in quickly. Frank Woolworth died at Winfield Hall on April 8th, 5 days before his 67th birthday. His rival Sebastian Kresge, head of the competing Kresge chain, closed every one of his own stores on the day of the funeral, in honor of the man he called the Nestor of the 5 and 10. The morning did not last long before the lawyers arrived. Frank Woolworth had been preparing a new will for some time. The document was drafted, reviewed, and ready for signature. It was designed to distribute his wealth among his surviving daughters and their families, with provisions for the company's continued management and for the care of Jenny, whose condition had by then been stable in its deterioration for years. He had not signed it. Whether the delay was procrastination, superstition, or simply the distraction of a man whose mind was increasingly elsewhere, the result was devastating. Without a valid new will, the courts fell back on the most recent signed document, a will drawn up in 1889, when Frank Woolworth was a struggling retailer with a handful of stores and a modest income. That will contained a single provision. Everything went to his beloved wife, Jenny. Jenny, who could no longer recognize her own daughters. The estate was valued at approximately $76 million. It included personal holdings, real estate, and shares in the company that now stretched across 2 continents. All of it passed to a woman who sat in a room she did not understand, under the care of a committee appointed to manage her affairs. Frank's daughters, Helena and Jessie, were named to the committee along with his trusted associate Hubert Parson, the man who had spent the last 3 years trying to outshine him. Jenny Woolworth lived for another 5 years. She died on May 21st, 1924, at the age of 71. Under the terms of the administration, the estate, which had grown to roughly $78 million, was divided into 3 equal parts. 1/3 went to Helena McCann, 1/3 went to Jessie Donahue, and 1/3 went to the only child of Edna Woolworth Hutton, a girl named Barbara, who was 11 years old and had already lost both of the people who might have protected her from what the money would do. Chapter 9. Poor Little Rich Girl. $26 million arrived in Barbara Hutton's life before she had any idea what to do with it. She was 11 years old when her grandmother Jenny died, and the Woolworth fortune was carved into thirds. Her share, held in trust, made her one of the wealthiest children on the planet. It did not make her any less alone. After her mother's death at the plaza, Barbara had been passed between relatives like an unwanted heirloom. Her father, Franklin Hutton, moved her to San Francisco, then back to New York, then to boarding schools in Connecticut and Manhattan. He was, by most accounts, an indifferent parent, but a gifted investor, and he managed Barbara's trust with enough skill that when the Wall Street crash of 1929 wiped out much of the Woolworth family's wealth, Barbara's portion actually grew. She entered adulthood richer than her grandfather had been at the height of his power. The public met her in 1930, when her family staged a debutante ball at the Ritz-Carlton that reportedly cost more than $60,000. It was the depths of the Great Depression. Bread lines stretched through lower Manhattan, and the newspapers were not kind. The headlines christened her the Poor Little Rich Girl, a name that would follow her for the rest of her life and that she would never manage to outrun. She married for the first time at 20. His name was Alexis Mudavani, a self-styled Georgian prince whose royal credentials were, at best, decorative. The marriage lasted 2 years. Barbara later said she realized almost immediately that Mudavani was more interested in her bank account than in her company. The divorce settlement cost her somewhere between $2 and $3 million, depending on which lawyer was counting. Her second husband, Count Kurt von Haugwitz Reventlow, was a Danish aristocrat with a longer name and a shorter temper. They married in 1935. Their son, Lance, was born the following year, and the marriage collapsed not long afterward. Barbara fought a bitter custody battle across multiple countries, and the press covered every hearing. The third marriage was the one the world remembers. In 1942, Barbara Hutton married Cary Grant. They were, on paper, the most glamorous couple in America. He was the biggest movie star of the era. She was the richest woman most people had ever heard of. The tabloids called them Cash and Carey. The marriage lasted 3 years. Grant was the only one of her 7 husbands who refused alimony. There were 4 more after him: a prince, a diplomat, a baron, and another prince. Each marriage followed a pattern that Barbara seemed unable to break. Infatuation, extravagance, disillusionment, separation. She gave lavishly to each husband, funded their lifestyles, absorbed their debts, and emerged from each divorce diminished in fortune and in confidence. Between marriages, she moved between hotels in Paris, London, Tangier, and New York, never settling, never alone for long, and never quite able to explain what she was looking for. Her closest companion through most of it was her cousin Jimmy Donahue, Jesse's younger son. Jimmy had inherited his own portion of the Woolworth estate and burned through it with equal enthusiasm. He was charming, reckless, and plagued by addictions that would eventually consume him. He and Barbara understood each other in the way that only 2 people raised inside the same wreckage can. Barbara was capable of extraordinary generosity. During the Second World War, she donated her London mansion, Winfield House, to the United States government for use as the official residence of the American ambassador to the court of St. James's. The gift was valued in the millions. She funded hospitals, schools, and relief programs in countries she had visited. She gave money to strangers who showed her kindness, sometimes in amounts that startled even her advisors. But the spending never stopped, and the fortune was not infinite. By the early 1970s, Barbara was living on a diminishing trust, selling jewelry and property to cover her expenses, and relying increasingly on the attention of people whose interest in her was conditional on her ability to pay for dinner. Then, on July 24, 1972, her son Lance was killed. He had been a passenger in a small Cessna scouting property near his home in Aspen, Colorado, when an inexperienced pilot flew into a blind canyon during a thunderstorm. Lance was 36. He had built a successful motor racing team in the 1960s, designing a car called the Scarab that had beaten Ferraris on American circuits. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him, one of the few genuinely stable people in Barbara's life. His death broke something that the marriages and the money had only bent. Barbara Hutton spent her final years at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Los Angeles. She was frail, largely confined to her suite, and attended by a small circle of staff. She died on May 11, 1979, at the age of 66. One biographer wrote that at the time of her death, $3,500 was all that remained of the Woolworth fortune. Others close to her disputed the figure, but no one disputed the trajectory. The girl who had inherited $26 million at 11 had spent nearly all of it searching for something the money could never buy. She was interred beside her mother and her grandparents in the Woolworth vault at Woodlawn. Chapter 10. 4 Students and a Lunch Counter. On the afternoon of February 1, 1960, 4 freshmen from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University walked into the F.W. Woolworth store at 132 South Elm Street in Greensboro, North Carolina. Their names were Ezell Blair Jr., Franklin McCain, Joseph McNeil, and David Richmond. They were 18 and 19 years old. They had been planning this since Christmas, when McNeil was refused a hot dog at the Greyhound bus station in town. That refusal had been the last in a long series of refusals, and it was the one that made them decide to act. They entered the store and bought toothpaste at the main sales counter. They kept the receipt. Then they walked to the 66-seat lunch counter at the back of the store and sat down. The lunch counter was for white customers only. Black customers could buy merchandise anywhere else in the store, but they could not sit at the counter. They could not order coffee. They could not eat a donut on a plate. The 4 freshmen knew this. They sat down anyway. A white waitress told them that the counter did not serve Negroes. Blair replied that he had just been served 2 feet away. The waitress repeated the policy. The students did not move. The store manager, Clarence Harris, was called. He asked them to leave. They stayed. The police arrived, looked at 4 young men sitting quietly on stools with a receipt in hand, and determined that no law had been broken. There was nothing they could do. The 4 stayed until the store closed that evening. They went back to campus. The next morning, they returned with 20 more students. The day after that, more than 60. By February 5th, more than 300 demonstrators filled the store, spilling onto the sidewalk outside. By the following week, the protest had drawn national press coverage, and similar sit-ins were erupting in Winston-Salem, Durham, Raleigh, and Nashville. Within 3 months, 55 cities across 13 states had seen their own lunch counter sit-ins, organized by students who had read about Greensboro in the morning paper and decided not to wait. That April, at Shaw University in Raleigh, the movement formalized itself as the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The Woolworth Company's response was slow, confused, and expensive. Headquarters in New York left the decision to individual store managers and refused to share the financial consequences. Harris, caught between corporate indifference and a protest that grew larger every week, shut down the lunch counter for stretches and tried to wait the students out. It did not work. A comprehensive boycott of the store gutted his sales. By midsummer, losses at the Greensboro location had passed $200,000, and Harris's own salary had been cut for failing to meet targets. On July 25, 1960, Clarence Harris gave in. He did not make a public announcement. He did not call the press. He asked 4 of his own black employees, Geneva Tisdale, Susie Morrison, Anitha Jones, and Charles Bess, to change out of their work uniforms and sit down at the lunch counter as customers. They ordered. They were served. They ate. The integration of Woolworth's lunch counters began not with a handshake between executives, but with 4 employees removing their aprons and sitting down. Frank Woolworth had built his chain on a simple idea. That price should be fixed, access should be open, and no customer should feel unwelcome. 60 years after his death, his own company had to be forced, by 4 teenagers with a tube of toothpaste and a receipt, to live up to that principle. The sit-in movement accelerated the desegregation of public accommodations across the South and became one of the defining actions of the American Civil Rights Movement. The Greensboro Woolworth store served all customers at its lunch counter for another 3 decades. When the store finally closed in 1993, a section of the counter was donated to the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of American History. The building itself became the International Civil Rights Center and Museum. Geneva Tisdale, one of the 4 employees who had been asked to sit down on that July morning in 1960, was still working at the store the day it closed. She had been there on February 1st, when the students sat down. She was there on July 25th, when she became one of the first black customers served. And she was there on the last day, 33 years later, when the doors shut for good. Chapter 11. From Nickels to Sneakers. The companies that killed the Woolworth chain did not invent anything new. They simply took Frank Woolworth's original ideas: fixed prices, open displays, high volume, thin margins, direct purchasing from manufacturers, and executed them on a scale that his successors never matched. Kmart opened its first discount department store in 1962. Walmart opened the same year in Rogers, Arkansas. Target followed in Roseville, Minnesota. All 3 understood what Woolworth had understood in 1879, that ordinary people would buy more if prices were low enough and the experience was convenient enough. But where Woolworth's company had grown cautious, these new competitors grew fast. They built larger stores. They moved into suburbs. They invested in logistics, computing, and supply chain management at a pace that left the old 5 and 10 model behind. For a time, the numbers still favored Woolworth. At its 100th anniversary in 1979, the F.W. Woolworth Company was recognized as the largest department store chain in the world. By 1982, it operated more than 8,000 stores worldwide. But the scale was misleading. The stores were aging. The merchandise felt dated. The lunch counters that had once been the social center of small-town life were losing customers to fast food chains. And the British subsidiary, which had contributed half the company's profits in the mid-1960s, had fallen into steep decline, forcing its sale in 1982 for $279 million. The most consequential decision of this era had nothing to do with variety stores. In 1963, the company purchased the Kinney Shoe Corporation and began operating it as a subsidiary. 11 years later, in September of 1974, Kinney opened a new kind of shop inside the Puente Hills Mall in the City of Industry, California. It was a specialist athletic footwear store designed to ride the jogging boom that was sweeping suburban America. They called it Foot Locker. Nobody at the time would have guessed that this single storefront in a California mall would outlive everything else the Woolworth Corporation had built. Through the 1980s, the parent company tried to reinvent itself by launching dozens of specialty retail formats: jewelry stores, cold weather outfitters, casual shoe shops, even Burger King franchises. The strategy was to fill malls with a rotating portfolio of concepts, replacing each failed experiment with the next. It produced activity, but not coherence. Meanwhile, Foot Locker grew steadily, carried by the explosive consumer demand for branded athletic shoes and a culture that was beginning to treat sneakers as identity. By the mid-1990s, Foot Locker and its related athletic brands had become the company's dominant source of profit. The variety stores that still carried the Woolworth name were bleeding money. On July 17, 1997, the last Woolworth stores in the United States closed their doors. That same year, Walmart was added to the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It took the spot that had belonged to Woolworth. In 1998, the company renamed itself the Venator Group, a Latin word meaning sportsman. The following year, it moved its headquarters out of the Woolworth building on Lower Broadway, into offices on 34th Street. The tower that Frank Woolworth had commissioned and paid for himself, the company's home for 86 years, was left behind. In 2001, Venator completed the transformation by changing its name to Foot Locker, Incorporated. The last corporate trace of the Woolworth name had been erased from the company Frank built, but not entirely. In May of 2025, Dick's Sporting Goods announced the acquisition of Foot Locker for $2.4 billion. The sale was completed that September. The deal made Foot Locker a subsidiary of a company that had no institutional memory of 5-cent merchandise or lunch counters, or the man who believed that cheap goods, displayed where customers could touch them, would change how the world shopped. Woolworth-branded stores still operate in Germany and a handful of other countries, run by a separate company with no connection to the American original. And the concept that Frank Woolworth pioneered, a store where everything costs a fixed low price, lives on in the dollar stores that now number in the tens of thousands across the United States. They are, in everything but name, his direct descendants. The Woolworth building still stands at 233 Broadway. Its lobby is intact. The caricatures of Frank Woolworth and Cass Gilbert still face each other from opposite corners. The tower is residential now, its upper floors converted into luxury apartments. Nobody works for the Woolworth Company there anymore. Nobody has since 1999.